Greetings, fellow explorers. It is time for yet another edition of Bug Fables Community Choice. This time, I asked you what you thought was the best attacking skill that Kabbu has in Bug Fables. And after 24 hours, we got a total of 252 votes. Without further ado, let's see what you all picked. And dead last, with a measly 4% of the total votes, is Boulder Toss. This skill sees Kabbu burrow under the ground to grab a boulder and then fling it at the enemy. After making contact, the leftmost and rightmost enemies take splash damage from the attack. So Boulder Toss is the only one of Kabbu's skills that does not ignore defense at all, which already makes it quite a bit worse than his other skills. The boulder itself does do decent damage, but that really only matters if Kabbu's attack set is below his base. And at that point, you're unlikely to use Kabbu to actually do damage to enemies either. Meanwhile, if Kabbu's attack was above his base, you're much better off using Understrike. Which, yeah, it's true that the first hit is initially weaker, but it hits twice and it ignores all defense. If you ask me though, the worst thing about Boulder Toss, it's the fact that you can't get the skill until after you get Understrike. By that point, it's already obsolete. And even without Understrike, you would only really use Kabbu to deal damage to an airborne enemy if you just had to get the enemy down, in which case Pebble Toss works just fine. And as if that wasn't bad enough, you have two other bugs with much better options to hit enemies that are airborne. Of course, there's V, who has almost every attack she has be able to hit airborne foes. But then there's Leaf, who has a skill called Icefall, which basically does everything Boulder Toss could do but better. The only thing that Boulder Toss can really do is have it splash damage to enemies that are very far away from your main target, which is ultimately meaningless when so many enemies have defense. All around, Boulder Toss is actually a pretty bad move. The only real thing it has going for it is that it looks cool, but that's really it. In 4th place, with 12% of the votes, is Pebble Toss. For 1 TP, Kabbu throws a pebble at an enemy. So, not to brag, but I feel like I'm the most qualified person to talk about this medal and why it's so good. But then I'd be lying to you, because this medal is also really situational. Pebble Toss has some advantages to it. It may only do 1 damage, but that also means it's very easy to measure how much damage you do to enemies. It also, surprisingly, ignores any and all defense unless it's from something like say Golden Ceilings or the Everlasting King's Tablet. However, what must be the biggest draw that Pebble Toss has is that it can actually skip entire boss phases. If you can build up enough turns on bosses with an HP trigger cap like say the Beast or the Everlasting King, you can actually skip future phases and end the fight faster. I'm not exactly sure how optimal this is for challenge running, but this is a pretty neat trick that you can use if you really felt like it. That being said, this skill does only 1 damage every time it makes contact. Unless it's versus a Venus Guardian while in the air, then it does 2 damage. On hard mode anyway. So realistically, you would only use this skill if you wanted to smack something down to the ground. And trust me, you'd have to be desperate to use Pebble Toss in that instance. It does have advantages. Only costing 1 TP means it's very cheap. It also only costs 1 MP, and oftentimes you'll find yourself having just spare MP to use up and you have nothing else to really spend it on. In those instances, it really will not cost you to use Pebble Toss just a few times in a run if you really needed it. Outside of any fancy tricks though, it really falls off in usefulness after Chapter 4 begins. Overall, I think of Pebble Toss as a very situational medal and skill overall. As a last resort, it's perfectly usable. Otherwise though, I think I'd pass. In 3rd place, with 17% of the votes, we have Kabbu's Heavy Strike. Basically Kabbu's basic attack, but with +2 attack power. This skill is simple but effective. Kabbu's main draw is just how despite the fact that he can only target the frontmost target on the ground, he does better against foes with defense. And this skill gives his basic attack a lot more oomph. It's useful for quick damage on enemies with defense, but otherwise, I think it's actually the weakest of the 3 TP skills to do a lot more damage in 1 attack. After all, V's Tornado Toss does better with higher attack power than Kabbu's attacks would, and leaves Frigid Confidence the benefit of freezing enemies solid for a few turns, which can be huge in turning the tide of a battle. That isn't to say the skill is bad though. It still has its advantages over enemies with defense, which is an advantage over Tornado Toss. It's also available not too late, whereas it still has some usefulness against some enemies early game. Overall, it's a pretty simple skill that tends to fall off later in the game, but is at least decent early on. In 2nd place, with 19% of the votes, Dash Through. Kabbu builds up speed and then rams into all ground-bound enemies on the opponent's side. Ignores 1 defense and does an additional damage over his base. I think the skill is alright, though this skill is much better geared towards random enemies you fight or in the Cave of Trials than actual boss fights. And to be fair, it does do good damage. There is very much a place for this skill in fights like, say, the Bandit Wasp Ambush, the Golden Settlement Technician Trouble, fighting Obama Honeys, the Seedling King, grinding at the Ant Kingdom Theater. There are lots of situations where this skill can be very useful for what is available. And speaking of availability, this skill previously would only be unlocked midway through Chapter 5. It's available now as early as after you finish Chapter 2, which opens up many more opportunities for this skill to really be useful. Overall, Dash Through was a very solid, albeit kinda niche move, especially for its TP cost of 5 TP. That's actually kind of a lot early game. And now, in first place with a meaty 48% of the votes, it's Kabbu's Understrike skill. Kabbu burrows under the ground and underneath the enemy's side, emerging from the ground like a dolphin before diving back into the dirt to hit one last time. Of all of Kabbu's skills, I believe this one is the most practical. It combines Kabbu's ability to ignore enemy defense, all enemy defense at that, with also being able to target airborne foes. And it hits multiple times, so with Kabbu's attack that goes above his base, this could easily be Kabbu's most powerful attack. It's not uncommon that this move is either practical or even optimal. For example, being able to hit Tidal Worm both the head and the tail, the Everlasting King when he has all of the artifacts active, except against the tablet for some reason. Or most notably, fights like Team Mackie and Team Slacker, where some targets have upwards of 2 or even 3 defense. And this isn't even getting to tough bugs, where everything has defense, and as a result, being able to ignore all defense is a huge deal. Understrike is simply fantastic. It's a reliable skill that hits airborne foes, and it ignores defense, which already outclasses Boulder Toss. It synergizes much better with higher attack stats, something it has over Heavy Strike, and it has good range when you emerge. Not as good as say Dash Through, but good enough for some very peculiar boss fights. The only instances where this move really falls short are some foes with question mark defense, like say the Everlasting King's tablet. It's also still the weakest of the really strong moves for each character, not quite being able to measure up as far as raw damage potential like say V's Hurricane Toss or Needle Pincer, or Leaf's Ice Rain. But still, beyond the 5 TP cost, this move costs 0 MP to really use, because Kabbu gains the skill in Chapter 4. Though it's kind of a shame because the fact that this skill is available earlier than Boulder Toss really just sets that skill up for disaster, because there's really no good chances to really use it. Not even in the Everlasting King fight, because the artifacts have 2 defense. And again, the splash damage rocks don't pierce defense either. But alas, that's how the game is played. Maybe if you're lucky you'll get Boulder Toss on a mystery run really early on. My final thoughts? I actually agree with the placements this time around. This was actually a pretty good list in my opinion. Good job, fellow explorers. If you're interested in more community choice lists, I have a playlist on the screen right now. Click and watch, and once you do, I wish you happy binging.